Welcome back to the course. This is Introduction to Azure Networking, and this is Lesson 4, where you'll deploy your first Azure NAT Gateway. By way of introduction, just a quick recap that links to the prerequisites for the course can be found in the Introduction section, and links to the deployment scripts which are hosted on GitHub can be found in the Resources section. In this lesson, we'll learn how to reuse, update and remove resources from the deployments performed in the previous lessons, how to create a public IP address and a NAT gateway, how to update subnets within the virtual network to use the NAT gateway, how to connect to the first virtual machine over the internet, how to connect to the second and third virtual machines over the virtual network, how to verify connectivity over the virtual network, and how to verify the new outbound public IP address of the virtual machines. Let's review the topology diagram for this lesson. First, let's recap on the resources that we're reusing from the previous lessons. These include the resource group, the virtual network and both of its subnets, and all three virtual machines and their associated resources. Inside the resource group, we now also have a NAT gateway, which has an associated public IP address, and the NAT gateway is also associated to both subnets within the virtual network. And now let's see what this looks like in the Azure portal once everything's been deployed. Here we are in the resource group view, and we can see a list of the resources we've deployed. From the top, we have the existing application security groups used to control internet and virtual network access. Next, we can see the NAT gateway and its associated public IP address. Then we can see the network security groups for both subnets within the virtual network. We can then see the virtual machines and their associated resources. And finally, we can see the virtual network. Now it's time for our demonstration, so let's get started. Here we are in Visual Studio Code. We have the deployment script open and our terminal is ready. As usual, before we execute the script, let's review it so we can understand what it's doing. From the top, we have our variables. Here we can see that we're reusing the resource group, location and virtual network from the previous deployments. We're going to update the subnets and we're also going to clear down the flow logs. To do this, we need the names of the subnets, their network security groups and their flow logs. Since we're clearing down the flow logs, we no longer need the log analytics workspace or the storage account. To remove them, we just need their names. Just a quick reminder, in the previous lessons, you likely changed the name of the storage account to be globally unique. Whatever name you chose needs to be reused here to ensure the deployment completes successfully. Finally, we're going to create a NAT gateway, which requires a name, which we'll also use to standardize the name of its public IP address. Now we have our variables defined, we can start to include the resources in the deployment. First, we can delete the flow logs, and to do this we need to provide their names and locations. Next, we can delete the log analytics workspace. For this we need to provide its name and resource group. Just a quick side note here, log analytics workspaces are placed into a soft deleted state, but we can override this using the force parameter, and since we're using a deployment script, we can also suppress the confirmation prompt by using the yes parameter. Next, we can delete the storage account, which also requires its name and resource group. We're also using the yes parameter here to suppress the confirmation prompt. Next, we can create the public IP address for the NAT gateway. This requires a name, a resource group and a location, along with a SKU and the allocation method. We can then create the NAT gateway itself. This simply requires a name, a resource group and a location, along with the name of the public IP address. Finally, we can update the subnets to associate the NAT gateway. For this, we need the name of the virtual network and its resource group, along with the name of the subnet and the name of the NAT gateway. We can now execute the script, which will deploy the resources. Here we are again in Visual Studio Code, this time with our terminal window maximized. Let's execute the script and observe the deployment. If you're following along, in a moment you may wish to pause the video until the deployment is complete on your side. Now our deployment is complete, let's change over to the Azure portal to review our resources. Here we are in the Azure portal, back in the resource group view. Let's review the NAT gateway. Under Essentials, we can see that it's being used within the virtual network, that it's associated to two subnets, and that it has a single public IP address. Under Settings, if we choose Outbound IP, we can see the public IP address that's associated to the NAT gateway. We'll make a mental note of this, as we'll need it later when we verify the outbound public IP address used by the virtual machines. Under Settings, if we choose Subnets, we can see that the NAT gateway is being used on the first and second subnets within the virtual network. Let's go back to the resource group, and now let's look at the virtual network. Under Subnets, we can see both of our subnets. If we review the first subnet, we can see that the NAT gateway is associated here. And if we review the second subnet, we can also see that the NAT gateway is associated here. Let's go back to the resource group and look at the first virtual machine. We'll again copy the public IP address to our clipboard, as we'll need this in a moment to be able to connect to the virtual machine over the internet. Let's go back to the resource group, and this time let's look at the second virtual machine. Under Properties, recall that we can see the private IP address of the virtual machine. We'll make a mental note of this, as we'll also need this in a moment to be able to connect to the virtual machine over the virtual network. Finally, let's go back to the resource group, and this time let's look at the third virtual machine. We'll again make a mental note of the private IP address under Properties, as we'll also need this in a moment to be able to connect to the virtual machine over the virtual network. Now that we've reviewed our resource deployment, let's switch back to Visual Studio Code and connect to the first virtual machine. Here we are again, back in Visual Studio Code. From here, let's use the public IP address of the first virtual machine to connect over the internet using the secure shell. Now that we're connected to the first virtual machine, let's validate connectivity over the virtual network. We'll perform a HTTP request and validate our public IP address in the process. We'll use the now familiar IP info API that we've used throughout the course so far. Here we can see that the request is completed successfully and that the IP info API has responded with the public IP address of the NAT gateway we've just deployed. This means that the public IP address that is associated to the virtual machine is now only used for inbound connectivity, since the IP address of the NAT gateway is now used for outbound connectivity. Now let's connect to the second virtual machine and again verify the public IP address to use for outbound connectivity. We'll perform the same HTTP request as from the first virtual machine. Here we can see that the request is completed successfully, and again the IP info API has responded with the public IP address of the NAT gateway. Finally, let's connect to the third virtual machine, where we should see the same behaviour as the first and second virtual machines. We'll again perform the same HTTP request as from the first and second virtual machines. As expected, here we can see that the request has completed successfully and that the IP info API has responded with the public IP address of the NAT gateway. We now have certainty over the public IP addresses used for outbound connectivity from our virtual network. That concludes this lesson. I hope to see you in the next one, where, using a service called Azure Bastion, you'll learn how to connect to virtual machines over the internet without them requiring a dedicated public IP address for inbound connectivity. See you next time.